Hey listeners, I love making this podcast, and I think it's important work. I love sharing these conversations with you, but it takes time and money to make it happen. I need your help to keep making it and bringing you these conversations. Would you consider supporting this podcast with a monthly donation? Monthly supporters will receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits through Patreon. You can go to the website, wdtatpodcast.com, and click on support to make a donation or sign up for the Patreon. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. In this episode, I talked to Matthias Roberts, my style guru and haircut inspiration, about his new book, Beyond Shame. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Matthias Roberts.
I'll
yeah, go for it.
It's Matthias. It's a soft
Matthias.
TH.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Thank you for correcting me. In fact, I might totally leave that in because I don't mind my guest correcting me. In fact, one of my first episodes, I got corrected by my good friend that I went to college with, and I misheard him, and he corrected me, and I was like, "Great, that's good. That's what this is for." So no problem. So my guest today is...
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, my guest is Matthias Roberts. Did I get it? Matthias?
Yes. Yeah, Matthias. Yep, that's right.
And Matthias is a psychotherapist and also a podcaster. His podcast, Queerology, was recently named one of the 12 best LGBTQ podcasts of 2019 by the Oprah magazine, which is incredible. Yeah. Congratulations on that. That's really cool.
Still giddy about that one.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think one of the things your podcast is known for is that you actually record. It's an LGBTQ podcast, and you record it in your closet.
That is true. Yeah. I'm actually in my closet.
You're in the
right
closet
now recording
right now.
this.
Wow. That's incredible. You and I met in 2016, the one and only time I went to what was then the Gay Christian Network conference, which is now Q Christian Fellowship. And I went to one of your workshops and talked to you a little bit afterwards. And I think in passing, we talked a little bit. And then afterwards, we connected online. And I reached out to you because I really liked your haircut. And I
remember this.
And I was looking back at on Facebook and Messenger, and there were all the pictures you had sent me of all the different sides of your haircut, and I still have the same haircut. So I want to thank you for the style that I have right now, that I continue to have. It's been good for me, and I get to publicly thank you now. So that's great.
It's a good haircut. I still rock that one too. So
yeah.
That's It's
awesome.
It's great. It works well. So
well, you have a book that is coming out January 7th, 2020, called Beyond Shame: Creating a Healthy Sex Life on Your Own Terms. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're probably going to find some tangents and rabbit trails, I'm sure, but that's the reason you're here. I haven't finished the book yet, which I'm sad. I really am looking forward to finishing the book, but I was reading it this week, and just in the first chapter alone, there were sentences that I had to just stop and write down and think, I got to unpack this a bit with Matthias. And so the first sentence that really just hit me is, here's a fundamental truth: shame makes us turn away. So talk to me a little bit about, what you learned about shame growing up, and what is shame?
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the first part of that question, I didn't learn anything about shame growing up.
Yeah. Well,
I think we
did, though, right?
I mean, I was shamed, right? Yeah.
We didn't know it.
Right. That experience of shame, I think, is one that was definitely ingrained. I mean, honestly, we can't go without being shamed. Like it's kind of a core. It's bigger than an emotion, but that's an easy way to talk about it. It's a core emotion to who we are as people. So we all know it. We all know that feeling of shame, kind of that face flushing, like I say in the book, turning away. And the interesting thing about it is it's a neuroaffective response. So that means it involves our whole bodies. So it's not just a cognitive thing. It's not just something that we feel. It's something that we both feel and are aware of and kind of all at the same time.
Yeah.
And one of the primary markers of it is when we're feeling shame, if we're in the presence of other people, we hang our heads, we turn away, we look towards the exit. A variety of different things is kind of a response of don't look at me. I don't want to be seen right now.
Yeah. And you mentioned this distinction that Brené Brown makes that I think a lot of people know about, but there may be plenty of people listening that don't know, between shame and guilt. Can you give us kind of the breakdown between those two? I think we mix them up a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so Brené Brown, who is a shame researcher and storyteller down at if you haven't heard of her, like get out under your rock right now.
Yeah.
But she's a researcher down at UT Austin, I believe, or Houston, I think. And she talks about shame as a distinguishment between guilt and shame. So guilt is a feeling of I have done something wrong, whereas shame is I am something wrong. I mean, that just kind of hits it on the head. Like the sense of guilt is a little bit more of it's a little bit more at a distance. We usually want to, when we're feeling guilt, we usually want to repair. We usually want to go to other people often, not always, but it's this almost a little bit more of a relational thing. Yeah. Whereas shame is almost inherently anti-relational, and it makes us want to separate ourselves. I'm not worthy of being in a relationship. I'm not worthy of resolving this because I'm terrible.
Yeah. I've talked, I think, on this podcast before about my own struggles with anger and how raising my kids, there was a time when I would get mad and yell and feel like I kind of lost my temper, I would feel shame, and I would feel this sort of spiral of, oh, I'm so horrible. Like I just would feel I would feel shame. And I can say now that over the years, as I've worked on that I still sometimes yell or I get mad or something happens. I feel a lot less shame than I used to, and now I feel I feel guilty. Yeah, I shouldn't have yelled, but I go and I repair the relationship, and I think that that's a helpful distinction. The shame causes these spirals, right, and it causes sometimes these really, really destructive patterns of thought that we have.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot harder to recover from a shame spiral than feeling guilty.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So your book is about creating a healthy sex life. And so what do you think this podcast is about? Things that are difficult for us to talk about and how to have hard conversations and just talking about things that are difficult. And definitely sex and sexuality are things that a lot of people have a hard time talking about, whether it's with their families or even within partnerships and marriages, with their loved ones, with friends. I mean, sex and sexuality seem like something we all probably have had some difficulty at some point in talking about, right? I can't imagine anyone that hasn't struggled with that. So what is it about that makes it so hard for us to talk about?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that because I don't feel like I have a particularly great answer as to that huge question of what is it about sex that makes it so hard to talk about. But I think, and I argue this in the book, there's something about sexuality that that exists at the very core of our personhood. In an expression of who we are. And so that almost inherently makes it an incredibly vulnerable thing to talk about. So that's almost the first hurdle. Like when we jump into areas of vulnerability, things that have the capacity to wound us, it automatically makes it harder to talk about because there's more at stake. The stakes are higher. So I think that's one reason. But two, like we live in a culture that has almost conditioned us to not talk about sexuality, to not talk about sex, where we see sex and sexuality as being something that is deeply taboo, especially within faith-based Christian communities. Sex is kind of treated as this thing that we all have to be hush-hush about. Like everyone does it, but we can't talk about it too much because, and these are my own thoughts, but maybe we'll find out that other people are doing it in ways that are quote unquote wrong or bad or not sanctioned by the church as being okay. Honestly, so much of our church politics are based on sex and sexuality and what we believe about those things. I think it would upend a few things if we started having more open conversations about it. Yeah.
It seems a little almost paradoxical too that we both sex is both taboo, like we don't want to talk about it too much and we want to avoid talking about it, and we find lots of euphemisms and ways to talk about it without talking about it and things like that. But then also we in the US, we're such a sexualized culture too, right? We're sexualizing everything, and so it's all around us. And so it seems like often I find even within churches sometimes those two things are going on at the same time. You know,
right.
I know you talk about purity culture, and I remember when I was in undergrad, we won't talk about how many years ago that was, but I attended one of a very evangelistic kind of charismatic service at this university in the town over. And I remember one night being there and this guy getting up, and he just, he had a word from the Lord, but really he was just chastising all of the women to dress more modestly. And so at the same time, he's like saying, we're not talking about sex and we need to sort of avoid sex by you guys dressing more modestly. But yet it's so dangerous and powerful that I need to get up here and make this big speech about it. It just felt so weird.
It's so messed up.
Yeah.
Those dynamics, they just set us up for failure. I mean, it is a big setup, I believe, that we really can't win.
Yeah.
It just, the shame and sexual shame is so prevalent in those kinds of environments.
Yeah. Can you tell, for those who don't maybe understand this term, and maybe I don't even completely understand this term of purity culture, can you talk a little bit about what is purity culture and kind of what does it maybe do to that ability to talk about sex and sexuality?
There's a variety of definitions depending on who you're talking to. I'll kind of give mine. I view purity culture as, it is a movement that was definitely placed within history. So late 80s, early 90s, kind of a response to the 60s, 70s, 80s is kind of sexualized culture that was present. In that time frame, purity culture kind of grew directly out of that. And it's this idea that our worth, our sexual worth, is based on and almost predicated on not having sex before marriage and only having heterosexual sex within marriage. So heterosexuality is a huge component of it, but one man, one woman, sex is only sanctioned within a marriage union. And anything outside of that is labeled as impure. So this whole movement grew out of that with books, sexuality courses. It was a whole industry for a long time, and still is to some extent, about how do we remain quote unquote pure. Purity being non-sexualized people, which is of course impossible, but it sets this really high bar for what purity is, and therefore was branded purity culture, because it's all about purity.
Yeah.
How can a young man keep his way pure? I think that's a verse in the Psalms, that kind of idea.
Yeah. I certainly remember growing up in that era, and I can remember, confessing to a friend of mine in college that I looked at pornography and I felt really bad about it. I felt all this shame about it. And then, of course, my friend said, yeah, me too, and I was like, I was so shocked and blown away that, like, wait, I thought I was the only one, right? Because we don't talk about it. There's all of this purity around it. And I still think it seems like a large part of it is less, mentioning, like, of course people have these other views, traditional views about marriage and sex, but right. It seems like you could still hang on to those and deal a lot differently with how you talked about it, or be open about talking about it. The thing that seems to be really causing problems more than anything is this, like, the shame and heaping shame on this topic that we're not going to talk about it, and we're going to make a big deal about it, but also that you're not going to get information, and we're not going to talk about it. There's, as you said, right? It's two things. It's no sex before marriage and heterosexual marriage, and that's not a lot of information.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like almost a hallmark, at least this is my experience of growing up within this. This may not be everyone's experience, but because of that, parents wouldn't even touch the topic with their kids. And so even basic level kind of sexual education wasn't even offered in purity culture, or for a lot of families in purity culture, because of this almost fear of sex and sexuality.
Yeah.
Linda K. Klein, who's an author, she wrote a book called Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. She writes about the effects of purity culture, particularly on women, and the fact that now there are a lot of women who grew up in that world who are displaying PTSD symptoms because of the ways that purity culture makes us go to war with our own bodies. It's a deeply damaging kind of rhetoric around sexuality. That you're right. I don't think it is necessarily predicated on what we believe about sex and sexuality. Like we can hold to maybe some more. I hate the word traditional.
Yeah. I don't have a better word, so please give me one.
Maybe more historical teachings on sex and sexuality. I believe. I mean, we can hold to those and work with our shame at the same time, and present them in a way that isn't shaming people who may hold to other sexual values, who may have a different sexual ethic. It doesn't have to be either or. Yeah,
you have this quote about that you began to go to war with your body when you're sharing sort of your experience of coming out, and that phrase, that way of talking about it, really struck me. Thinking about the ways that over the years, through adopting sort of Platonic philosophy and Christian theology, that we really looked down on the physical, and we elevated the spiritual to be the most important thing, and it disconnected us from our bodies. And so in some ways, it's not surprising that we would go to war with our bodies when we are creatures, we are embodied beings. So what are those connections between this disconnect from our physical bodies in the way we think about faith, for example, and not being able to talk about sex and sexuality? Why we don't live in our bodies, Matthias? What's happening?
I mean, living in our bodies is a scary thing, I think, because when we start feeling our emotions and letting them mean something, a lot of times we don't know what to do with that. And I think sexuality in particular can feel like I mean, the senses, the way that sexuality almost, it does involve our entire bodies. It can feel uncontrollable. I mean, I think I often have clients where when we're starting to kind of enter the realms of working with emotion, grief is one that comes to mind of where the sense of, if I let myself feel grief, if I let myself feel sad, I'm afraid I'll never be happy again. There's kind of that fear of, if I let myself pay attention to this, I may never escape. Which of course is not true, but it can feel that way. And when we haven't had these things modeled for us of what healthy grieving looks like, what healthy sexuality looks like, what it looks like to move in and out of emotions and more of an embodied way of being in the world, of course, moving that direction would be terrifying, because it's something that our rational minds don't have control over. And it's only an illusion anyway that our minds have control over emotions, because, I mean, the neuroscience shows that that's not actually true. Our emotions, our thoughts are organized around emotion as opposed to the other way around. So we're fooling ourselves anyway, but it's a terrifying thing.
No, that I read. Yes, I read that in your book, and I was slightly terrified because you said by the time we notice shame, it's already occurred in our bodies, that we need to become more aware of our bodies and emotions rather than change them. And I had to sit there for a second and really ask myself if you were right or if I believed you. Because I'm my personality, I like to fix things. I am a doer, I like to have things I can work on. I like to, even myself, I like to improve myself and learn new things and, do counseling and therapy and centering prayer and all these different things to help me be better, right? And work on the things that I need to fix. And I read that sentence that just becoming aware of our bodies and emotions rather than change them. And I thought, that can't be right. There's got to be something I can do, right? I mean, just being aware of it. I mean, unpack that. That seems like a lot of people might react similarly to me, and feel like, you mean there's not something for me to do? That is kind of scary,
It is. I mean, and I would say, like, becoming aware of your body and your emotions and everything that's going on kind of below the neck, but even in your head too, because emotions fill up that space as well. Like, that in itself is a project. So it is something that we can do, but it's something that we have a little bit less control over. It feels I mean, it goes right back to what we were talking about, that kind of that terror.
Not being in control. That's scary to me.
Right. Because I think a lot of us have learned how to, quote unquote, control our emotions, which is not a bad thing. Like, having control over those things and knowing when we are in situations when we can express emotion and when we can't. Like that's, I mean, it's part of. I mean, it's a good thing. But when that's all we do, when we're not letting our emotions actually run their course, when we're not actually allowing our bodies to experience the things that they're meant to experience, that's when the split starts happening. And we're talking much broader than sexuality now. And we can start running some damage when we try to continually cut. Because emotion has to get out somehow. Feeling has to get out somehow. And usually that's when it starts manifesting in ways that are deeply unhealthy. or we numb it using substances.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Yeah, I did another interview with a friend of mine who works in addiction and recovery, and we talked a lot about addiction being a lot more than drugs and alcohol. It being, you know, how we cope with things that are hard. There's lots of things we can use to deal with our shame, to deal with how we're feeling, and sex can be one of those things too, in many different forms, and you know, lots of different ways. So, I mean, that's a good segue to talking about your book is aimed at creating a healthy sex life. So what do we need to do to get healthy, Matthias? Help us.
Yeah. So, I mean, I honestly believe that sexual health is, so of course there's like a medical definition of what that is, of which that's not a question that I'm particularly interested in. Like we can talk, have those conversations. Other people can have those conversations. But when it comes to the more emotional side, more of a shame-free kind of idea of sexuality, I believe that that's something that people have to define for themselves, which I know can be a little bit scary also. This idea that, wait, there may not be, I don't necessarily believe that there is a prescriptive sexual ethic that is out there, even prescribed in Scripture, if we're talking about a Christian tradition. I just don't see it. And so healthy needs to be in some ways self-defined, but I consider self-defined being relationally defined as well. So I mean, self-defined would almost seem selfish. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a selfish thing. I'm saying if we're going to have healthy sex, which sex is inherently relational, it connects us, then those connections need to be healthy, which then makes healthy sex having to be relational, and so on and so on. So it involves so much more than just us. But what can be healthy for one person can be incredibly unhealthy for another person, and so on and so on. Yeah. So in this book, I was very careful about trying to not make a prescriptive ethic as to this is healthy sexuality, this is not, but instead kind of chart a path for us as to things that we may have to wrestle with that are true about sex and sexuality, that as we navigate can help us define what our values are and hopefully lead us to more healthy sexuality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I can understand that for some people that feels a little disappointing, and it could be on many different sides. We love, diet books that give you the 10 steps to achieving this healthy diet, and we want the same for our relationships and everything else too. And
totally,
it comes up again and again, I think, on a lot of different topics in this podcast that there's a lot of work to do. And a lot of times we all have a lot of our own work to do. And so it's actually not helping anybody to try and do that work for them. They're not going to get to that place of health and freedom and beyond shame as you're hoping you can help people with. So I appreciate that a lot. One of the gifts, your practice is focused on LGBTQ youth and adults. And one of the gifts that I think, since we're talking about why is it hard to talk about sex and sexuality, one of the gifts, I think, of the LGBTQ movement and community for the church in particular, regardless of what anybody believes about that specific question with Scripture or what they believe about LGBTQ people, even aside from that, and Tim Otto in his book, Oriented to Faith, kind of talks about this, that it's a gift. And the gift that I see is that it has asked us to think about sex and try and sexuality and to talk more about it. And I mean, in some ways, maybe that's where a lot of the pushback comes from. Like, well, people don't want to talk about it, but that is a gift. In my community in Waco, Texas, we went to the Gay Christian Network conference because we were having these conversations. And one of the activities we ended up doing as a community was we asked everyone to think about their own coming out stories, how they developed their own sexuality. And without the LGBTQ movement and people asking us, just by their existence and their being, asking us to think about coming out, we ignore that as straight, hetero, cisgendered people. It's easy for me to not have to think about that because nobody's asked me to, and I'm normalized, and so I don't have to think about it. So I love that is a gift, and I really want to encourage people wherever they're at to think of it as a gift that we get to talk about this because we need to. But I wanted to make sure and say that. Something else that you mentioned in the book too was about you mentioned I'm going to get my terms wrong. Aromantic and asexual folks who have lower levels of sexual drive or interest or whatever. And we kind of forget those people when we talk about sex and sexuality sometimes. And I had this thought when I was reading that in addition to purity culture, right, that abstinence is also a sex life. And I think that might blow the minds of people who are proponents of abstinence, but you can't not have a sex life, right? You have a relationship in some way to your sexuality. And I think we've tried to maybe do an end around, maybe try to ignore that or pretend that's not true until you get married, right? In a heterosexual marriage. Right. And then you have a sex life, I guess.
Right. Yeah, and I'd say like we can unpack that a little bit more. Like whether or not you're choosing to have sex, you are a sexual being to a point. Because and this is why I make this point in this book, because there are people in the world who are asexual, aromantic, who do not experience a sex drive or do not experience a drive towards romantic relationships, where that actually doesn't exist. And I think the point that I make in the chapter that you read is that so often when we talk about sex and sexuality and we argue that it exists at the very core of who we are as people, which I believe is true, the same thing is true for people who are asexual, aromantic, is that is a defining part of who they are as people as well. I think often when we argue sexuality is part of personhood, then we're arguing that asexual people don't have personhood, which is simply not true. And I think we can learn a lot about relationships from people who don't experience sexual drive, who don't experience romantic drives, because they do relationships in ways that are very different from those of us who experience relationships as sexualized or as romantic. And I don't get into it a whole lot in the book because the book is about sex. Right. And it is mostly for people who do experience sex drives. But I think that's a really important point for us to realize is that there are other people in the world who experience these things way differently than the majority of us do. Yeah. I was struck at the Gay Christian Conference, network conference that I attended. There's a time at the end of the conference for testimonies. And there was a young man who got up and said, he identifies as asexual, and he kind of felt like he didn't find where he could fit in at the conference until he went to a workshop on celibacy and the option for LGBTQ people to remain celibate. And he doesn't necessarily, he's on the affirming side. And so he didn't expect to identify with the group that was advocating celibacy, but he found the things that they were saying about spiritual friendships and the ways that God meets our needs in different ways. He actually ended up identifying a lot with them more than anyone else. And that kind of blew my mind. I had never thought of that before and made those connections. So yeah, I mean, totally. We all need connection and belonging. And in so many ways, we create shame around
how we belong or how we exist. And it drives so much of our lives, you know, it drives so much of our unhealthy patterns. And so, yeah, I'm really thankful for your book and for you tackling this question for as you say in the first chapter, like this is a book for everyone. And I really, really appreciate that, because shame is such a big thing for anybody to tackle in their own life. It's so central, you know, and as well as sex and sexuality. Yeah,
totally. And yeah, and I deeply believe that when we work with our own sexual shame, particularly, we'll learn a lot about our just general shame structures. So I think it's very rewarding. It's very rewarding work to work with our sexual shame, because it does have a bearing on our everyday life, the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
I mean, what shows up in our daily lives show up in the bedroom, and vice versa. It may not look exactly the same, but it's very, very similar. We can't really escape those things. So
yeah, and we have very much tried to divide that, right? And even people talking about maybe that are progressive and just say like, well, whatever's in the bedroom, just leave it in the bedroom, right? Like, let's ignore it. Right. Let's just say, you know, you can do whatever you want in the privacy of your own home. You hear that a lot, right? From people who kind of maybe don't want to talk about it. But as you're saying, what is in the bedroom doesn't stay in the bedroom, because it is part of who we are. Yeah. Exactly. It follows us around.
Yep. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Well, it's a good time to start wrapping up. And I like to wrap up with 3 questions.
Great.
Something that we learned, could be something we were reminded of, or something we want to emphasize too. Something that we can do, an action step that we want to recommend that people can do. And then something we want to share as a resource. You've shared a couple of resources, I think. So any other resources you can share. And I'll go first, so you have some time to think about it.
Okay.
As I said, I've only read a chapter, but I feel like I've already learned a lot from your book. One thing in particular that I've already talked about that I'm still unpacking is this idea that becoming aware of our bodies and emotions rather than working to change them, that is the work, initial work at least, you know, to become more aware, and not focusing on needing to fix or needing to change, but just sitting with, okay, I'm feeling shame, or I'm feeling whatever emotion. How does that feel in my body? Noticing, paying attention. I'm quick to want to, okay, well, if I breathe, or if I do exercise or do something, I can change that feeling and make it go away. And I'm not sitting with it. So that idea that the work is just sitting with it and noticing and paying attention. So I definitely learned a lot from that. Something we can do, as I said, with our community, doing this exercise of writing your coming out story, especially if you are cisgendered, heterosexual, and haven't had to do that kind of work because of needing to come out. Think about your coming out and your own development. I probably still have lots to unpack there that I could spend some time doing, but it really helps us think about our development as sexual beings, as we've been talking about. It's so central to who we are. It's really valuable to take the time to do that. As I said, the gift of the LGBTQ community to us cisgendered heterosexual people is asking us to think about it when we haven't had to. And that's really important work for all of us to do. And then a resource that I'll recommend will be Queerology, Matthias's podcast. It's a great resource, not just because Oprah said it, but because I listen and really enjoy it. I listened this week to the episode with Vivian Getz, the bisexual Catholic. That was very interesting episode. And of course, I'm a Jennifer Knapp fan, so I love getting to hear interviews with her. And it's a fantastic resource for further learning, further understanding, and you have lots of great guests and lots of great things to say. So,
thank you.
Yeah. So, Matthias, what are your 3 things? Something we learned, something we can do, and then something you want to recommend.
Yeah. So something I learned that you still have my haircut.
Yes. Haircut bros.
And I love that. That actually makes me really happy. So.
Me too.
Yeah. Something we can do. I mean, I really would encourage people to. I don't want to overuse this idea of paying attention, but pay attention to your sexual shame. I mean, pay attention to shame in general, but especially when it comes to sexuality, because it really does permeate so much of our sexuality. And as we start becoming more aware of it, we become more aware of how present it is everywhere. And like you said, like that really is the first step to bring some awareness to it, because if we're not aware of it, we can't work with it. So that's what I would encourage people to do, is just notice when shame happens. And as a resource, I mean, since we're talking about it, I am going to recommend my book.
Yeah.
I think I go into a lot more detail onto how to do that within the book, and then how to work with our own values. And if you pre-order the book now, if you order the book before January 10th, we're giving away a bunch of extra resources to go along with the book.
Cool.
One of those is a masterclass with Linda K. Klein, who I was talking about earlier,
awesome.
called 4 Practices You Can Start Now to Move Beyond Shame. And it's a 60-minute class with Linda and me, and we're talking about literally like practices, so very real practical things that go beyond just kind of these heady thought exercises into here are things you can do. That's only available to people who pre-order the book by January 10th. To get that, all you have to do is email your receipt to beyondshamebook@gmail.com. You can buy it anywhere you want. Email a receipt, a photo of the receipt to that email address. We'll look at it really quickly and then send you that resource along with some exclusive artwork. You'll get the first chapter, all of that for people who order the book by January 10th. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah, so excited. This masterclass, like, it's so good. Like, Linda brings so much expertise and knowledge to this conversation. I'm really grateful that she was willing to do that. So,
yeah, definitely. Before I forget, I wanted to recommend 2 other podcasts that I really enjoy. One of them is co-hosted by my cousin-in-law, so I don't know if that's nepotism or what exactly, but it's called Swoon Podcast, and it's about, she's a sex therapist, and her co-host Gina is I think she's called a relationship coach, and I don't remember what, but it's fantastic. It's all about sex. It's if you want to get into the nitty gritty of details and relationships and sex and all kinds of stuff, that's a great one. And it's definitely going to. I remember this associate pastor at a church that I worked at, who would take the middle school kids who were doing confirmation, they were doing whatever the sex ed curriculum was. And they would say all the dirty words about the genitalia, and they would put them all on the board. And no matter how bad they were, they're going to write them all down. And then at the end of it, okay, we all got that out of our systems. Now we're going to say, penis, vagina. We're going to use the terminology so Swoon is great for that, because it's practical. It's super good. And it is part of sponsored by Therapy Den, and they have another podcast called Say More About That, which is great for normalizing therapy as a therapist yourself. I know
it's a good thing.
That's hard for people, and I've been in therapy. Therapy's great. Everybody should get therapy. We can all work on our shame a lot better if we would be willing to do that. So,
true.
I just wanted to throw those out there because they're so good.
I need to look into those. That's amazing. So, yeah.
There's too many podcasts. You and I make podcasts, there's so many good ones. But it's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Matthias, thank you so much, not just for your haircut, but for your time.
It's my pleasure.
And for sharing, for your book, for all the time that went into writing it, and all the work that you're doing around helping, especially LGBTQ people. We know how vulnerable they are, and they need all the help they can get, you know? So I really appreciate all your work.
This has been so much fun.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?